Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of Unification, which are episodes 7 and 8 of Season 5 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user poll. My latest user poll ended in a tie between two episodes, Unification and the Enterprise episode Desert Crossing, and I had mentioned before, in the case of a tie, I would be the tiebreaker, and I'd rather actually prefer to review a good episode that I like rather than not a crappy Enterprise episode, because I reviewed one of those somewhat recently. So I chose to review the two-part episode, Unification. Now, from my perspective, the poll was just released a week ago. However, I won't be releasing this video for another 3 weeks from the time I'm recording it, so perhaps the poll had changed by then, but I have to go off what it is for me now. At the moment, it's a tie, so I'm choosing Unification. Anyway, Unification is the two-part episode where Picard and Data go to Romulus to look for Ambassador Spock, who went missing. When they go there, they find that Spock went to Romulus in an effort to make peace between Romulan and Vulcans. However, they find out that Romulans have been using this as a ploy to send an invasion force to Romulus. However, Picard and Spock outmaneuver the Romulans and are able to warn the Federation about the invasion, and so the Romulans destroy their own invasion force rather than let them fall in the hands of the Federation, and so the day is saved, and Spock decides to remain on Romulus to continue his peace efforts there. So this was a pretty infamous, or pretty, I wouldn't say infamous, it's a pretty famous episode. It's a cameo from the original series. There were 3 cameos from the original series actors in the Star Trek The Next Generation TV show. There was Dr. McCoy, who had an Everbrief cameo in the first episode, which is sort of just to send off the, transition between the two shows. And this would be the second one with Spock occurring in this two-part episode about the Romulans, and the third one would become Scotty would appear in the episode Relics, and the one with Scotty would be known as the best of the cameos. In fact, a lot of people prefer that to Unification. In fact, some people even go as far as to put it in their top 10 Next Generation episodes, because they're like, oh, this is the original series cameo done right. But I think it's a way overrated episode. I think I already did a review for it where I talked about how the episode was just fine. I think people were just starving for a good version of a original series cast member cameo, and so that's why they were so happy to get Relics. So the implications being that this was not a good cameo, and I think that is the general agreed upon view of these episodes. So most people, I don't think, hate this episode. Most people think it's kind of mediocre, kind of okay, kind of like a nice try, but it didn't quite get there, and I agree with that sentiment. Now, this episode was actually one of the first episodes of Star Trek Next Generation, or Star Trek franchise for that matter, that I watched, because it came out in the late 1991, which was around the time I was first getting into Star Trek. So I had watched the Star Trek movies, and then I started watching episodes of the original series, and then I moved on to start watching episodes of the Next Generation, and this, because there's a Spock cameo in it, and at this moment I'm only familiar with the original series. It was like one of the first Next Generation episodes that I watched, because it came out shortly after I got into Star Trek, and I wasn't very impressed with it. To go without saying, it would take other Star Trek episodes to really get me into the Next Generation. So this episode came out shortly before Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, and it was used as sort of a promotional tool to promote Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. And so Leonard Nimoy was kind of, I wouldn't say he was forced into it, but he was, it was suggested that he do this. It's kind of like when actors go and do like press release tours when their movie come out, and they have to sit down in a room where all these different reporters come and take turns asking them questions. So, doing stuff to promote the movie. It's kind of in the same vein with that, where they have, where Leonard Nimoy was sort of, I wouldn't say pushed, because there's no indication that he didn't want to do it, but he was sort of you know, suggested that he do it in order to promote Star Trek VI, which was coming out, I believe, a month or so after the release. Yeah, a month after the release of these episodes. So what was interesting is that because of schedule issues with Leonard Nimoy, they actually filmed Part 2 before they filmed Part 1, because Leonard Nimoy isn't really in Part 1, except for at the very, very last scene where it's like, "You have found him, Captain Picard." So really, he's not in Part 1. He's in Part 2, and because of the schedule, the way wonky it was, they had to film Part 2 first, and then film Part 1. Not that it really made any difference. But that's like kind of the main thing I want to get into, is because this didn't really need to be a two-parter. It seemed like they stretched it out to a two-parter because they wanted to make it more epic or make a bigger deal out of it. But Part 1 was kind of unnecessary, except for the scene with Picard and Sarek, which was actually a really nice follow-up to the episode Sarek. And as I said, I saw this episode before I saw Sarek, and actually it would be like a year or so until I did actually see the episode Sarek, because I talked about this before. There's something weird about the station I was watching it on when I was a kid, because I had to watch it on reruns. I saw season 3 last. Like, I saw all seasons 1 and 2 a couple times, and season 4 like 3 or 4 times before they actually aired season 3. So season 3 was like kind of an enigma for me. and Sarek was at the end of season 3, so it took me a while before I actually saw it. And so I didn't really, I have a feeling, even rewatching this episode now, even though it's been years since I've seen, decades really since I've seen season 3, it still have that feeling of being like sort of distance and not really getting the references that they were making about Picard and Sarek and their mind meld, whatever. It didn't really make any sense to me, but I guess it's my fault for watching it out of order. I think it was actually a really good follow-up to the episode Sarek and the experience. Although I do think they make somewhat bigger deal of mind melds than have ever been made in the past. Usually, like, Spock mind melds are just random people just distill their information. They don't seem to be imprinted on them and understand them. But I suppose you have to know the specific kind of mind meld that was used in the episode Sarek, where Picard and Sarek were linked for an extended amount of time, and Sarek was using that to gain Picard's stability, and then Picard in return received all of Sarek's chaos, since he was suffering from a emotionally debilitating disease, which we see from this episode. He succumbs to that disease and passes away. So I do think it is well earned. I didn't get that at the time of watching this episode, but after seeing the episode Sarek, I do understand how Picard would feel so attached and sort of in the mind of Sarek, and so feel emotionally involved in finding Spock, which he feels like he knows through his father's eyes, which is a good true story. It's a good way to sort of tie these Next Generation cast to this original cast member of Spock. So I thought it was a good use of that. But other than, as I said, other than the scene with Picard and Sarek, which really could have been transplanted into episode 2. Episode 1 is mainly a lot of fluff. A lot of just like, there's a lot of stuff with Picard and Data on the Klingon ships, and Picard tries to sleep on this little shelf, and Data's staring at him, is like, "Whoa, Data, what the fuck are you doing?" Like, all that. I mean, I wouldn't say it's horrible, but it was kind of padding. It was kind of unnecessary. And also, I have to say, the entire side plot of Riker going off on this investigation of finding the Vulcan ship or whatever, that was just, again, the whole storyline was padding. It was just something to give Riker to do. Like, they go to a junkyard and this guy's being a dick to them, and they go to find the ship and it's not there, and they get attacked by this other ship, but that leads them to go to this bar, and they find this Ferengi, and he's being a dick to Riker, so he picks him up and basically yells at him, and then they go do this and blah blah blah. The storyline reminded me a lot of Miller's storyline from The Expanse season 1. Those who've seen The Expanse know what I'm talking about. And I think the reason they have that similar vibe to it, I think they both are based off of that sort of noir 60s or 40s detective type films. Yeah, so I think they both have their roots on that. But the difference between them is the Miller storyline from The Expanse is actually really good. So this kind of reminds me of a lesser version of that. One that's not, that tries to be all, you know, inspired by the noir genre, but doesn't actually do a very good job at it. And for the most part, it's not interesting. To be honest, and I can see why a lot of people don't like these episodes. And speaking of what these episodes do wrong, let's talk about Sela. So this is the second and the only the last appearance of Commander Sela, who is Tasha Yar's daughter, which, you know, they introduced in Redemption Part 2, which was only like 7 episodes before this one, so it was shortly after. So I think the plan was to have her be a recurring character, but I think they realized how much this character did not work, so she never appeared again. It was just an excuse to get Denise Crosby back on the show, and it was just, it was I don't know. Like, I'll get more into, like, if I ever cover Redemption, I'll get more into how that introduction to her was just really silly. I mean, it was kind of interesting that they were trying to tie in yesterday's Enterprise into the current timeline, but it just didn't work, and it was just really silly. And if Tasha Yar had a daughter with a Romulan, and she ended up growing up to be more Romulan, she wouldn't look exactly like Tasha Yar. That's not how genetics work. But whatever. And she was just a silly character. And the way when she, like, captures Picard and Data and Spock, they don't throw them in prison, they don't handcuff them, they don't torture them, they just sit them down in like a little office room, and they don't even restrain Picard or Data. And why the hell are Picard and Data even there? Because she's talking to Spock and she wants to get Spock to send out a fake message. Why aren't they in prisons and chains? Why isn't Spock being tortured and saying, you must do this? And why don't they torture Picard to entice Spock in order to do that? But no, they just sit him down in the office, be like, here, say the speech. And Spock's like, no, I'm not going to do it. So she just leaves the room, leaves them alone in this office that has computers and terminals. What the hell? And of course Data goes to Spock, and they're like, oh, they don't know that we're in their computer system, so let's use it to create this holographic ruse. So they create a holographic ruse in order to overpower them. Why aren't they in prison? Why aren't they in chains? Why aren't, at the very least, is a freaking guard watching over them? This is ridiculous. It has a really, like, cartoonish feel to it. And the whole thing with Riker, the hologram Riker showing up going, drop your weapons. Drop your weapons. That's something I used to quote all the time. But it's silly. It has a real cartoonish feeling to it. And then I had to remember this episode came out right around the same time the episode The Game came out, which had a really, really cartoonish feeling. So then I was like, okay, that makes kind of sense. But I will say, I don't think these episodes are, I wouldn't call them bad altogether, because there's a lot of good aspects. I already touched about the Picard and Sarek thing. The Picard and Spock interrelations actually really work. I think there's definitely a strong point of the episode, seeing Spock interact with Picard, and Picard, like, ordering him to go back and saying this kind of cowboy diplomacy won't be tolerated, and then Picard and Spock comparing him to Kirk. Of course, that's the obvious thing to do, but it does make sense for the characters. And then Spock and Picard connecting on their knowledge of Sarek, and then the ending with Spock having the mind meld with Picard to learn more about his father. That was actually a really touching ending. That was a great way to end the episode. So their interactions were really good. Although I do realize, like, Spock brought up the events of Star Trek VI and be like, well, I was the one who enticed Kirk to go to, to make peace with the Klingons, and the Enterprise crew almost got killed because of that, so I decided I'm never going to do that again, so I want to go off and do diplomacy on my own and not put other people at risk. That was like an obvious tease. As I said, this episode came out a month before Star Trek VI, so it's obviously teasing the audience, oh, this is what's going to happen, you better go see Star Trek VI coming out next month. And so it's kind of outdated in that term. If you think it's been like 80 years or something, in the actual timeline of the show since these events happened. So you wouldn't think this would be fresh in Spock's mind and that he would still be referencing that. And I still think it's a bit silly that he would just run off to Romulus without telling anyone. That seemed a lot of like plot conveniency, and they have to bring up, oh, here's the commercial for Star Trek 6. But I mean, those are only minor complaints. I think overall I still did really enjoy the interactions with Spock and Picard. The interactions with Spock and Data were interesting too, although I'm kind of lukewarm on them because it felt almost a bit too forced, a bit like, oh, these characters are alike, let's have them compare. But it was interesting, you know. One of my favorite things is the contrast of Spock saying, well, Data is like the perfect Vulcan, so what every Vulcan aspired to be perfect logic, and Data's like, well, you've rejected your human side, which is something I always inspired to, so you're rejecting what I am seeking. So that was cool. That was a cool interaction, cool interplay between them. And another thing I did really like about this episode is the look at Romulan culture. I think this is one of the first like deeper looks into the Romulans, because usually they're just like some generic bad guys. But here we actually get to see some Romulan civilians. We get to see Romulus. We get to see like Data and Picard go to like a cafe and get some soup, and like just some Romulan civilian teens who are like different than the typical type of Romulans that we meet, because they're more of the radicals who want to reconnect with Vulcan, talk about their culture and how their grandparents taught them about Vulcans, and this gets into the whole heritage of Vulcan and Romulus, which I think at this point in canon was mostly explored in bonus material. It hadn't really been touched on that much in the show itself. In the original series, they're just like, oh, we look alike. I think maybe they touched a bit on a bit more in the episode Enterprise Incident, but here they make it sort of more clear that the Romulans were a group of Vulcans who left Vulcan like centuries ago, and they formed their own little offshoot there. So it was interesting getting into that. Interesting seeing young different Romulans wanting to connect with that. We see the Romulan culture and how like authoritarian it is. Actually reminds me a lot of Cardassian culture as depicted on Deep Space Nine. I think Deep Space Nine did a more like thorough job of further depicting like what kind of, it felt more tangible of an Orwellian type culture, whereas the Romulan culture here just seems kind of just a generic bad guy spies. They didn't get that much into it, but at least they gave us something. It's better than most other Next Generation episodes did. So I did appreciate the episode for that aspect of it as well. So I wouldn't say like, I could get why this episode isn't seen as the best original series cameo, and a lot of people thought it was a lesser version. They got it right with Relics, because although I do think Spock was used really well here, and I do like the interactions with him and Picard, it was padded out too much, and it was plagued by that silly ending. They could have if they condensed the story into one episode and sort of lost all that stuff with Riker and the Ferengi and all that other stuff, and all the Klingons whining at Picard, being a dick to him. Like, they just padded it out to try to make it seem more epic, which was a mistake. If they made it a more personal character story and sort of forward the like Sela twisting a mustache, twirling a mustache, and being a cliche evil villain who's duped like a Scooby-Doo villain, leave all that out and just focus on the character interactions between Picard and Spock and their sort of connection through Sarek, then this actually would have been a really good episode. So to break it down, basically, they were trying too hard in this episode. One other thing I want to give a really quick shout out to is they did a nice little callback reference. It was really subtle, so a lot of people might not have picked up on it, to the episode The Enemy, where they found a couple of Romulans on Leonard Core up to no good doing some shady things, but they never explained what those shady things are. What were they actually doing? But here it's implied like Riker and the Enterprise go to Leonard Core for their investigation, so it's implied that what they were doing actually had something to do with this planned invasion of Vulcan. And it is interesting, and I think we should have got more on why the Romulans are trying to invade Vulcan, and more on this, them trying to invade Vulcan and stuff like that, instead of making it all Scooby-Doo-ish where Sela just puts Picard and Data in the office where they have access to computer terminals. That's just silly. Anyway, my rating for Unifications Part 1 and 2 out of 10 is a 5 average. As I said, I wouldn't say it's a bad episode, because I love the Picard interactions with Spock. I love the callbacks with Sarek, like seeing Sarek right before he died. Very tragic scene, and then Picard telling Spock about it. Very powerful, and as I said, the ending with the mind meld was also extremely powerful. But there's just too much nonsense in this episode. Too much padding, too much, oh, look at how epic we are. You know, scenes I wouldn't say were necessarily bad on their own, but there was just like, you know, Riker confronting the Ferengi, that didn't suck, or the Klingon being a dick to Picard, that didn't suck. It was just too much of it that was just filler, that was just like sugar, and they didn't focus enough on the heart of the story, so it kind of fell apart. And then you do get the cartoon villain of Sela, which probably knocks it down from a 6 to a 5 just by herself, because yeah, that was just cheesy. But I'm not going to say it's a bad episode, because the Spock's and Picard stuff was very good. Anyway, that is it for my review of Unification. So now is time to look at the options. What are going to be the options for the next poll to determine which Star Trek episode I review next is going to be. Okay, so now let's pick our next options. Going to the random episode generator. First we'll go to the original series option, which is going to be Amok Time. In the throes of his Pungfar mating period, Spock must return to Vulcan to meet his intended future wife, betrothed from childhood. This is seen as one of the best episodes of the original series. I maybe don't like it that much, but I actually grown to appreciate this episode a lot more, so I do like it a lot as well. It's a great episode that explores the Vulcan culture, so if you want me to review that, we can do that. Next generation option is going to be Redemption. Oh, I just brought that up in this review. So if you want follow-up, if you want me to get more into Sela and why she doesn't work as a character, and also the Klingon Civil War storyline with Galron and all that, which was really interesting in this two-parter, which I actually really like, but again, it's brought down by Sela. But still great two-parter, so if you want me to talk about that, I can do that. Well, pretty good options so far. So let's see what we got for Deep Space Nine. Deep Space Nine episode is Bada Bing Bada Bang. Okay, so if you want me to rant and rave about an episode that I really hate, I really do not like, because it's centered on Vic Fontaine about some stupid hologram program about some 60s gangsters, whatever, blah 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 blah. It's so stupid. Can't stand this episode. I can't stand Vic Fontaine. Anyway, so if you like that tone, you can vote for that one. So we'll go into Voyager, see what the Voyager option is going to be, and that is In the Flesh. Oh boy, another episode. So 2 episodes I love, then 2 episodes I hate, because I can't stand this episode. I named this as one of the worst. I think it made my top 10 worst Voyager episodes of all time. This is when they completely ruin Species 8472 and have them act like a bunch of putz, idiots who like try to infiltrate Starfleet and act like they're in Starfleet, and Chakotay comes and fall in love with them. Ridiculous episode. So again, 2 options if you want to hear me rant and rave. Okay, so next let's go to see what the Enterprise option. We go to random number generator. Okay, season 3. We'll go to season 3, which I believe has 24 episodes if I remember correctly. Let's see what this is. Okay, number 20. So let's go. Oh, that's Next Generation. Let's go up to Enterprise, go to IMDb and see what season 3 episode 20 corresponds to. So season 3 episode 20 is going to be, oh, The Forgotten. This, I wouldn't say it's a bad episode. You're not going to hear me rant and rave, but it's not all that great. It's okay. I know some people really like this episode because it deals with Trip having to deal with the people lost in the recent Cindy attack. And I think there's some good moments in there. There's some things I appreciate about this episode, but I wouldn't say it's one of the better episodes of Season 3 of Enterprise, which I really love. It's kind of okay. I can get into that more if you like. So those are your options. Be sure to vote in the poll, which I will have a link to in the description below, which will take you to the straw poll website. You can vote for the next episode. I will close the poll in about a week after I put the poll up. But the next episode review, which I'll do, won't come out for like another month. So about a month from now, you'll get the winner of the poll. So be sure to vote in that. Also be sure to check out my channel for many more Star Trek videos, as well as many other videos I do on other shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Lost, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.